It started with a whisper, a rumor that flickered through the corridors of the palace like a ghost. But whispers have a way of growing louder when the stakes are high, when power, pride, and family collide. Imagine for a moment that your world is suddenly ripped apart, not by strangers, not by enemies, but by those you once trusted most. That is exactly the storm that descended on Harry and Meghan Markle, a storm that threatened to tear apart everything they had built. Their reputation, their charitable work, their very place in the royal family. Picture this. It was a quiet morning, the kind that usually signals calm and routine. Harry was reviewing some documents for their latest charitable initiative. Meghan was drafting notes for a speech meant to inspire. And yet, neither could have predicted the blow that was about to fall. You see, the palace isn't just a home. It's a chessboard where every move is calculated and every word carries weight. And in this game, one misstep or one betrayal can change everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The shock didn't come from an official announcement or a public rebuke. It came in a message, a note so simple, so casually delivered, yet packed with the force of an avalanche. It informed them that their charity, the very organization they had poured their hearts into, was being restructured. Its name would change, its mission would shift, and perhaps most devastatingly, the royal titles that had once set them apart were now hanging by a thread, poised to be revoked. Can you imagine the humiliation? The sense of betrayal? A life built around public service, suddenly invalidated by those closest to you. But why would William and Kate take such drastic measures? Was it jealousy? A sense of duty? Or a more complex web of strategic moves within the monarchy? The answers aren't simple. And as we dive deeper into this story, you'll see that nothing about this situation is straightforward. Every smile hides tension. Every polite gesture could mask resentment. And every public appearance is a stage for drama that the world only glimpses in fragments. Now, let's be honest, the world loves a royal scandal. From Diana's heartbreak to Meghan's rise in public opinion, the story of the monarchy is never without conflict. But this isn't just another headline. This is a tale of family, power, and heartbreak colliding in a way that no one saw coming. You might think you know the dynamics between Harry, Meghan, William, and Kate, but the truth is far more intricate, far more emotional, and far more explosive than the tabloids could ever convey. There are layers upon layers of unspoken rules, of silent rivalries, and of expectations that can crush even the strongest personalities. Harry and Meghan had already faced countless challenges before this moment, from media scrutiny that bordered on harassment to public judgment that often felt unfair and relentless. They were no strangers to pressure. But the palace operates on a different level. Here, tradition holds more sway than sentiment. And when William and Kate moved, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a calculated statement, a demonstration of authority, and a challenge that tested the very core of Harry and Meghan's resilience. Imagine the scenes behind palace doors, the quiet tension in hallways, the whispered consultations with advisors, the deliberate pauses before speaking. Every gesture was loaded with meaning. A simple glance, a subtle nod, a careful choice of words, all of it communicated volumes. And yet, outside the palace walls, the public had no clue. The world only sees the polished appearances, the smiling photos, the staged events. But inside, there is a storm raging, a storm fueled by frustration, heartbreak, and a sense of betrayal that cuts deeper than any media headline ever could. And then came the charity issue. The organization that Harry and Meghan had nurtured was more than a project. It was a symbol of their independence, a platform for their values, and a demonstration of their commitment to making a difference in the world. To have its name changed, its focus shifted, and its leadership questioned is akin to erasing a part of themselves. Imagine the indignity, the feeling that even your most sincere efforts are subject to scrutiny and control from those who claim to have your best interests at heart. It's a paradox, loved by the public, yet constrained by the very institution that should have been a source of support. Now, you might wonder, how did this information come to light? There were leaks, of course. Palaces never remain silent for long, and insiders, those who know the rhythms of royal life, cannot help but share what they know. Some of the details were subtle, a comment at a dinner, a passing remark during a charity event, a hint in a meeting. Others were unmistakable, direct communications that left no room for doubt. And the cumulative effect of these revelations? Heartbreak, tension, and an inevitable confrontation that no one could avoid. What makes this story especially compelling is the human side of it. We tend to think of royals as figures of privilege, immune to ordinary struggles. But behind the carefully curated images and polished public statements are real people grappling with real emotions. Fear, frustration, anger, and sorrow, they all exist behind the public smiles. And in this scenario, Harry and Meghan were not just facing professional or public challenges. They were confronting deeply personal wounds inflicted by those they had trusted most. So, what does this all mean for the monarchy, for the couple, and for the world watching? For one, it signals a shift in power dynamics. It shows that titles and appearances do not guarantee protection. It reminds us that the royal institution, steeped in centuries of tradition, operates on rules that can be invisible and unforgiving. And it hints at a broader story. One of ambition, strategy, and the relentless pressure to maintain image and authority, no matter the personal cost. And while we might feel sympathy for Harry and Meghan, it's also worth asking, what could have been done differently? Could there have been a middle ground? Could dialogue have prevented the heartbreak? Or was this collision inevitable, a consequence of choices made over years, shaped by public scrutiny, personal ambition, and the weight of expectations? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they set the stage for the revelations that follow. Because here's the thing, what you've just read is only the beginning. Behind palace doors, every action has consequence, and every decision carries weight that ripples outward in unexpected ways. And as we peel back the layers of this story, you'll discover betrayals you didn't see coming, alliances you never expected, and a cascade of events that would leave even the most seasoned royal observers in shock. So, I ask you, if someone you trusted most turned against you, would you be able to hold your ground? Or would the weight of expectation, public opinion, and familial pressure crush you? This is exactly the dilemma facing Harry and Meghan, and the answers will shape the future of their legacy, and perhaps even the monarchy itself. And yet, even in the face of such devastation, there is resilience. There is strategy. There is the human instinct to fight, to survive, and to reclaim what has been taken. No one saw it coming. Not the staff, not the public, not even Harry and Meghan themselves. On the surface, life seemed calm. They smiled for cameras. They hosted charitable events. They gave speeches about hope, unity, and social responsibility. But beneath the polished veneer, something was shifting, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. Tension had begun to creep into the palace, like a shadow at dusk, stretching longer and darker with each passing day. Imagine waking up one morning and sensing that something isn't quite right, though you can't pinpoint it. That's how Harry felt. He was reviewing documents for a new initiative. Something he believed could leave a meaningful mark on mental health advocacy, when he noticed a change in the tone of the messages he was receiving. Emails from advisors were more formal, cryptic even. Calls that had once been warm and supportive were now short, measured, and full of hesitation. Meghan noticed it too, during a meeting with charity representatives. The energy was off. Conversations that had previously flowed freely were now tinged with tension, like everyone was walking on eggshells. It's easy to forget that for all the glamour and attention, royal life is a pressure cooker. Every word, every gesture, every smile is analyzed, dissected, and interpreted by millions. But in this moment, Harry and Meghan were not yet facing the public. This was a storm that was quietly gathering inside their own circle, among the people they trusted most. It started with small things, a missed greeting, a slightly curt reply, a subtle shift in body language. And in the palace, body language speaks louder than words. For Meghan, the tension was almost physical. She felt it in her chest, in the way conversations felt like battles, in the lingering looks exchanged across rooms. She had learned over time to navigate the treacherous waters of royal etiquette, but nothing had prepared her for the undercurrents brewing now. It was as if every smile from William carried hidden meaning, every polite nod from Kate was a veiled warning. And while they had faced scrutiny before, from the media, from distant courtiers, This was different. This was close. This was personal. But what made this moment even more intense was the irony. Just weeks earlier, Harry and Meghan had been celebrated for their charity work. Their foundation had been praised for innovative programs, and public opinion had shifted in their favor after years of relentless scrutiny. The media portrayed them as a couple who had endured, who had fought for independence, and who were now making a genuine difference. Yet, the very people who should have supported them, who shared their blood and their history, were quietly plotting a maneuver that could unravel it all. And yet, Harry and Meghan went through the motions. They hosted luncheons, attended meetings, and spoke at events, all while carrying a weight invisible to the public eye. Every handshake was calculated, every smile measured. Behind the curtains, whispers traveled fast. Courtiers, assistants, and staff, all who observed the subtle shifts, knew that something was about to happen, though no one could say exactly what. It's here that the story starts to twist. Because calm is always deceptive in the palace. Calm is rarely innocent. It's the pause before a storm, the moment of stillness before upheaval. Harry sensed it, though he couldn't yet name it. Meghan felt it too, in her intuition sharpened by years of navigating public life and media scrutiny. They were both waiting, unknowingly, for a blow that would come faster and harder than they ever imagined. Even more insidious was the fact that the palace had begun a subtle campaign of psychological pressure. Not overt threats, not public shaming, not yet. But micro-movements designed to destabilize. Meetings were scheduled at inconvenient times. Advisors asked questions that seemed innocuous but carried hidden implications. Reports on their charity's financials were highlighted in ways that suggested mismanagement. Nothing was concrete. Nothing was overtly accusatory, but the intention was clear: unsettle them, make them doubt, make them vulnerable. And what makes this more shocking is that Harry and Meghan were not unprepared. They had built defenses. They had allies, both inside and outside the palace. They had media teams, legal counsel, and public relations experts at the ready. They had contingency plans. Yet, no plan could prepare them for the emotional weight of betrayal by family, the kind that pierces deeper than any headline or public criticism. Because when it comes to family, loyalty is assumed. Trust is given freely. And when that trust is violated, the impact is devastating. Imagine the breakfast table that day. Harry reviewing documents, Meghan jotting down notes. Their children playing nearby, blissfully unaware of the tension clouding the adults. The contrast is stark: innocence versus experience, calm versus chaos, hope versus looming betrayal. It's almost cinematic, the quiet before a storm. And in this calm, every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every decision made carries enormous significance. And then the first ripple came. A simple email, an innocuous-looking message from the palace communications office, requesting a meeting to discuss the future of charitable initiatives. At first, they thought it was routine, but something in the phrasing, in the timing, hinted at an undercurrent. The message wasn't threatening, not overtly, but it contained a tone of inevitability. Things were shifting, whether they were ready or not. It's important to understand the psychology here. Humans, even in positions of power, respond to subtle cues. Harry and Meghan, highly attuned from years in the public eye, felt it immediately. Their instincts screamed that this was more than a standard meeting. Something was about to change. Something fundamental. And as the day wore on, small incidents compounded the tension. Courtiers who had once been friendly now seemed distant. Staff who had offered guidance now hesitated before speaking, even in the simplest interactions. Passing someone in the hallway, attending a briefing, the couple could feel the walls closing in, the environment shifting from supportive to strategic, from predictable to perilous. By evening, the weight of anticipation had become almost unbearable. Meghan, sensing the growing pressure, confided in a close aide, voicing fears that had been simmering all day. Harry, meanwhile, was quietly making notes, reviewing potential scenarios, trying to anticipate what could happen next. But no amount of preparation could mitigate the emotional impact of the revelation that was coming. Because the palace doesn't operate in public alone. Decisions are made behind closed doors, often without warning, often without transparency. And when those decisions involve family members, the personal stakes are exponentially higher. What's about to happen is not just an administrative change. It's a declaration of power, a calculated move to reshape the hierarchy, and an emotional blow designed to leave its mark. And yet, despite all of this, Harry and Meghan continued to smile, continued to function, continued to present the facade of calm, because they understood the stakes, because they understood that, in the palace, perception can be as powerful as reality. But the storm was coming, and soon, the calm would shatter. As the night descended, the couple prepared for sleep, unaware that by morning, their world would be profoundly altered. The first pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Small gestures, subtle communications, and cryptic notes were converging toward a single, devastating outcome. And while the world slept, behind palace doors, plans were being finalized. Plans that would test the resilience of Harry and Meghan in ways they had never imagined. They were about to receive a message that would strip away more than prestige. It would challenge their identity, their mission, and the very foundation of their public life. And when it arrived, the storm would no longer be silent. It would roar. The palace corridors had never seemed more ominous. Marble floors echoed with each step, chandeliers shimmered under dimmed lighting, and the air carried a weight of anticipation that felt almost tangible. For Harry and Meghan, the day began with routine meetings, carefully planned engagements, and the familiar hum of activity. Yet beneath it all was a growing tension, like the static before a lightning strike. And then, the message arrived. A private meeting had been scheduled. William and Kate requested their presence. The reason was vague, the timing abrupt, and the tone, though polite, left no room for doubt. This was serious. Imagine standing outside a room, knowing that behind the closed doors lies a confrontation that could change everything. That was Harry and Meghan in that moment. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Staff whispered in corners, moving with careful discretion, fully aware that history might be in the making. Even the security detail, usually impassive and procedural, seemed alert to the tension that hung in the air. The meeting room was intentionally private, stripped of unnecessary distractions. A long, polished table dominated the space. Chairs were arranged deliberately, William and Kate on one side, Harry and Meghan on the other. Advisors sat at the periphery, their expressions unreadable, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. The couple knew they were walking into more than a discussion. They were entering a carefully orchestrated chess match, one in which every word, every expression, and every pause carried weight. William began. Calm, measured, almost warm at first. He spoke of family, duty, and shared responsibilities. His voice carried the authority of tradition, the weight of legacy. But underneath that calm veneer was a strategic edge, a subtle pressure that made every word feel like a test. Meghan, sharp as ever, noticed it immediately. She felt the invisible tug, the way tone can manipulate perception, the way language can be wielded as a weapon. Kate's approach was different, but equally powerful. She exuded composure and control, a steady presence that contrasted with Meghan's intensity. Yet her statements carried subtext, layers of meaning that only insiders could decode. When she referenced the charity work, her words seemed complimentary. But every compliment was framed with a subtle reminder of hierarchy, expectation, and tradition. Every suggestion she made implied a course correction, a realignment, a reassertion of authority over initiatives Harry and Meghan had believed were theirs to control. At first, the conversation remained measured. Phrases like, "We need to ensure consistency," or "We must consider legacy," floated through the room. On the surface, these could be interpreted as standard administrative concerns. But the delivery, the timing, and the gaze that accompanied them told a different story. The palace was signaling that independence was a privilege, not a right, and that boundaries had been drawn, boundaries that Harry and Meghan were perilously close to crossing. The couple responded cautiously, testing the waters, asserting their perspective without appearing confrontational. Harry spoke of vision, of innovation, of impact. Meghan emphasized collaboration, transparency, and commitment to causes that had become the hallmark of their public identity. But as the dialogue progressed, it became clear that William and Kate were not interested in collaboration. They were delivering an ultimatum. Subtle at first, like a shadow creeping across the floor, but unmistakable. They were asserting control, redefining the rules, and demanding compliance. The tension in the room escalated with every passing minute. Advisors occasionally interjected, their voices carefully neutral, but their eyes betrayed concern. Meghan's hand tightened around her notes, her knuckles whitening as she processed the implications. Harry, usually the calmer of the two in public settings, could not hide the flicker of frustration in his expression. Even small exchanges, shifts in seating, brief glances, the timing of pauses, added layers of psychological pressure. At one point, William leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. "We understand the work you're doing is meaningful, but it must align with the family's expectations. There is no alternative." The room seemed to shrink in that moment. Meghan's stomach sank. Harry's jaw tightened. The words were simple, almost bureaucratic, but the weight was immense. This was more than a conversation. It was a declaration, and it carried consequences. Kate followed, strategically reinforcing the message. It's not personal. It's about legacy, about continuity, about protecting what the institution represents. Every syllable was carefully chosen, every pause calibrated. The underlying implication was clear. If Harry and Meghan resisted, the repercussions would extend beyond criticism. They could affect status, titles, and control over their charitable initiatives. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. No one spoke. Each participant gauged the other's reactions. Meghan's eyes scanned the faces across the table, reading subtle cues, measuring tone, analyzing posture. Harry did the same. Both realized that this was not a dialogue in the traditional sense. It was a performance, a negotiation conducted with psychological precision, where mistakes could be costly. Then came the pivot, the revelation that would define the meeting. It was not an immediate confrontation, not an outright demand, but a carefully layered statement that forced realization. The charity's name would be reviewed, its leadership scrutinized, and the couple's royal titles were now under consideration. The room seemed to contract under the gravity of this declaration. Harry and Meghan, seasoned and resilient as they were, felt the emotional impact acutely. The psychological dynamics were fascinating. William and Kate maintained composure, reinforcing authority while avoiding overt aggression. Harry and Meghan navigated a delicate balance between assertiveness and diplomacy, attempting to protect their work and their dignity. Yet, beneath the surface, emotions surged, frustration, disbelief, and a deep, personal sense of betrayal. For all their public poise, this confrontation was raw, human, and deeply personal. It was a moment that underscored the complexities of family dynamics within the royal context. Here, loyalty is assumed but not guaranteed. Authority is inherited but continually tested. And independence is tolerated only so long as it does not threaten established hierarchies. Harry and Meghan had long sought to carve out a space of autonomy, to redefine what modern royalty could look like. In this room, they confronted the harsh reality that the palace, and even family, retains ultimate authority. The meeting concluded with formalities, polite nods, and expressions of mutual understanding. But as Harry and Meghan left the room, the weight of what had been implied lingered in the air. They knew that outside appearances, official statements, and public facades would not capture the full gravity of what had transpired. This was a private reckoning, a turning point that would shape decisions, strategies, and emotional responses in the days to come. Back in their private quarters, Meghan voiced what both felt, a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and sorrow. "They can't just change everything," she said softly, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Harry's response was quieter, contemplative. "They don't need to," he said. "We'll see what they do next." And that, in essence, set the stage for the next move, a cascade of events that would not only redefine the charity, threaten their titles, and disrupt public perception, but also test the resilience of their relationship, their family bonds, and their very identity as modern royals. Because the secret meeting was only the beginning. What happened behind those closed doors sent shockwaves through their lives, rippling outward in ways that would surprise, anger, and intrigue both the public and the palace insiders. And the aftermath of this meeting would prove that no one, not even those closest to you, can predict the full measure of a calculated royal maneuver. Charity had always been at the heart of Harry and Meghan's public mission. It was more than a responsibility. It was a statement of purpose, a way to show the world that they could use their platform for good. Every initiative they launched, every program they funded, every speech they delivered, carried with it the weight of intention. But in the aftermath of the secret meeting with William and Kate, that platform, so carefully built, so emotionally invested in, was suddenly under threat. And not from critics outside the palace, not from the press, but from within. Imagine dedicating your life to a cause you genuinely believe in. Imagine the sleepless nights, the planning, the fundraising, the emotional energy poured into every event. Then, imagine being told, gently but firmly, that your work no longer belongs to you, that the name, the brand, the very identity of your charity is being reconsidered, rebranded, perhaps even reassigned. That's the emotional and psychological blow Harry and Meghan were about to endure. The first signals had been subtle. Advisors delivered feedback that seemed routine, suggestions about messaging, reminders about compliance, notes about branding. At first glance, none of it seemed threatening. But the subtext was unmistakable. Every note, every recommendation, every helpful piece of guidance carried the implicit message: your independence is limited, and your authority is conditional. The charity that Harry and Meghan had believed was theirs to direct had suddenly become a tool for broader strategic objectives set by William and Kate, the very family members they had trusted implicitly. Meghan was the first to sense the full weight of the situation. She had poured heart and soul into community programs, particularly those focused on women's empowerment, mental health, and youth engagement. She had built networks, leveraged media attention, and created partnerships that were recognized internationally. And yet, the subtle moves by the palace suggested that all of this could be redirected, repurposed, or even erased under the guise of oversight and legacy protection. It was a scenario she had prepared for theoretically, but never emotionally. The erasure of her work, not through public criticism, but through internal redirection. Harry, meanwhile, felt a mixture of frustration and helplessness. He understood strategy, having navigated decades of media scrutiny, royal protocols, and international attention. But strategy alone could not inoculate him against the emotional weight of seeing a mission he cared deeply about potentially compromised. Every interaction with advisors now felt like a test. Every update about the charity's operations carried a layer of threat, even neutral-sounding statements. "We need to align with family legacy. We're charged with implications, compliance, or consequence." And the public, as always, remained oblivious. To the world, Harry and Meghan were still champions of good causes, still progressive, still innovative. But the quiet internal struggles painted a very different picture, a battle for control, for influence, for the ability to continue the work they had passionately undertaken. And the stakes weren't just emotional, they were strategic. The charity wasn't merely a platform for activism, it was a symbol of autonomy, a tangible measure of how far Harry and Meghan could operate independently from the monarchy. Losing that control, even partially, was a devastating blow. Behind the scenes, advisors from both sides were already positioning themselves. Courtiers loyal to William and Kate emphasized the importance of alignment with traditional expectations. Some suggested structural changes that would dilute Harry and Meghan's influence, redirecting the charity's focus and potentially changing leadership roles. Each suggestion, though presented professionally, carried an unmistakable undertone. Your work is valuable, but only if it fits within the boundaries we set. The psychological impact on Harry and Meghan was immediate and profound. It wasn't just about control, it was about identity. The charity had become an extension of themselves, a reflection of values they held dear. To have it altered, even subtly, was to challenge not only their authority, but their very sense of purpose. Meghan in particular, who had experienced intense public scrutiny and judgment, felt this deeply. The charity was her sanctuary, a space where she could channel her voice, her energy, and her influence into tangible change. The prospect of losing that, or having it reshaped by others, felt like a personal betrayal. Meetings with advisors escalated over the following days. discussions that were initially procedural turned into strategic debates. Every suggestion about restructuring, renaming, or rebranding was met with careful, measured responses from Harry and Meghan, who were determined not to relinquish control without a fight. Yet, the underlying tension was undeniable. The palace had made its position clear. The charity must align with the broader vision of the monarchy. It was not a negotiation, it was a mandate. Adding fuel to the fire was the media's reaction, or more accurately, the anticipation of media reaction. Even without a public announcement, rumors began to leak. Journalists, always alert for signs of tension, sensed a shift. Social media speculations grew. The optics of a charity being restructured or renamed raised questions. Was Harry and Meghan's influence waning? Were they losing favor within the family? Each rumor, each headline, intensified the emotional strain. The couple knew that once the story broke, the public would form judgments based on fragments of information, amplifying the pressure they were already under. And yet, Harry and Meghan were nothing if not resilient. They strategized, they adapted, they reinforced their networks. But resilience does not erase vulnerability. Every adjustment, every defensive maneuver, came with an emotional cost. The charity was more than an organization, it was a lifeline. To see it threatened from within, by those closest to them, was an emotional paradox. Pride in what they had built, grief over the potential loss, frustration at the lack of control, and anger at the betrayal that had become unavoidable. At night, Meghan would reflect quietly, processing the day's revelations. Harry would analyze potential outcomes, considering both strategic and emotional consequences. Together, they navigated the uncharted territory between autonomy and obligation, between family loyalty and personal conviction. Every decision was weighted, every conversation carefully managed, every public appearance meticulously calculated. But the looming question remained. How much of their independence could survive before the palace's influence reshaped everything they had fought for? The turning point came with the first formal discussion of renaming the charity. Words like legacy, alignment, and continuity were repeatedly emphasized. Titles and phrasing were debated. Mission statements were reviewed with a scrutinizing eye. And through it all, Harry and Meghan realized a sobering truth. Their influence was conditional. Their vision, no matter how well-intentioned, existed only as long as it did not conflict with the monarchy's priorities. The charity they had built as a reflection of their values was now a vehicle for broader objectives, not necessarily their own. It was an emotional minefield. Pride clashed with practicality. Purpose collided with protocol. And through it all, they were forced to maintain composure, to navigate the palace hierarchy, and to preserve the public image that had become inseparable from their mission. Behind closed doors, the discussions were tense. Voices were calm, but the unspoken weight of power dynamics filled every corner. Every suggestion was a potential pivot point, every compromise a potential concession of independence. Yet, even in the face of this internal siege, Harry and Meghan remained determined. They understood the stakes, both emotionally and strategically. They knew that giving in too easily would set a precedent that could undermine every initiative they launched in the future. They recognized that this was more than a charity. It was a symbol of what it meant to operate autonomously within an institution designed to control and contain. But as the discussions continued, a quiet realization dawned. Their autonomy was limited, and the palace was prepared to act decisively. The rebranding, the restructuring, and the subtle moves to control leadership were not suggestions. They were strategic decisions, backed by authority and intent. Harry and Meghan faced a stark choice: comply and retain some semblance of influence, or resist and risk losing it entirely. And as the night drew on, the couple could feel the walls of control closing in. The charity, their passion, their symbol of independence, was under siege. Every advisor, every policy review, every internal discussion underscored one inescapable fact. The palace intended to assert dominance, reshape the narrative, and remind them that titles and privilege do not guarantee freedom. A title may seem like just a word, a formal designation, a ceremonial label. But in the world of royalty, it is far more than that. A title carries authority, history, privilege, and, most importantly, identity. To lose a title is not merely symbolic. It is a stripping away of status, a public declaration that the individual is no longer part of the hierarchy in the way they once were. And for Harry and Meghan, the threat to their titles was not hypothetical. It was real, imminent, and deeply personal. It started subtly, with remarks during meetings, suggestions that their roles should reflect the broader family vision and align with tradition. At first, these comments felt like polite guidance, perhaps even protective advice. But as the weeks went on, the message became unmistakable. Their titles were in jeopardy. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex, titles once seen as permanent hallmarks of their identity, were now under scrutiny. The palace, represented by William and Kate, was signaling that their authority, independence, and public presence would be contingent on compliance. Imagine the psychological impact. Harry had grown up under the weight of titles, the expectations attached to them, and the constant public gaze. Meghan, as a newcomer to the institution, had already faced intense media scrutiny, public skepticism, and an uphill battle to define her own role. Titles had given them a sense of legitimacy, a platform to operate with influence, and a buffer against external criticism. To have those titles threatened was to challenge not only their public roles, but their very sense of self. The conversation about titles was delicate, strategic, and carefully orchestrated. William framed it as a matter of family consistency, a question of legacy and continuity. Kate emphasized alignment, the importance of ensuring that public roles reflected the hierarchy and expectations of the monarchy. Their words were courteous, even gentle in tone, but the subtext was impossible to ignore: compliance or consequence. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a clear assertion of power, delivered in the most controlled, strategic manner possible. Harry and Meghan listened, absorbing every nuance. They weighed their responses, knowing that any misstep could be interpreted as defiance, arrogance, or disrespect. Their public personas, carefully cultivated over the years, were not enough to shield them from the implications of this confrontation. The palace operates on subtlety, tradition, and the unspoken understanding that titles are both privilege and responsibility. And in this case, that understanding came with a stark warning. Their titles were no longer guaranteed. The broader public remained unaware. In the media, Harry and Meghan were still celebrated for their initiatives, their speeches, and their global presence. Headlines praised their efforts and framed them as progressive figures challenging outdated norms. Yet beneath the surface, the internal reality was more complex, more fraught, and more emotionally charged. Their identity, the very foundation upon which their public influence rested, was under threat from the most intimate quarters of family and tradition. Advisors approached with caution, offering counsel on how to navigate the discussions, maintain dignity, and protect the couple's public image. Legal teams reviewed historical precedents, exploring the mechanisms by which titles could be formally rescinded or redefined. Every detail mattered. The phrasing of official statements, the timing of announcements, the optics of appearances. But no amount of preparation could fully anticipate the emotional impact of the eventual decision. Titles, after all, are not just functional. They are emblematic, deeply tied to personal and familial identity. For Meghan, the threat was particularly poignant. She had already endured intense public scrutiny, cultural criticism, and personal attacks. Titles had offered a form of protection, a symbolic assertion of her place within the institution. Losing them would not only be a professional setback, it would be an emotional blow, a public signal that her role, her voice, and her influence were no longer fully recognized. Harry felt a similar weight. The Duke of Sussex had long been conscious of the responsibilities his title carried: representation, duty, and service. The possibility of losing that title, or having it redefined, was more than a symbolic issue. It was a challenge to his ability to operate autonomously within the family and on the global stage. Discussions with palace officials became more intense. Every phrase, every meeting, every carefully worded suggestion carried layers of meaning. The couple realized that this wasn't just about tradition, it was about control. Titles, after all, are instruments of influence. Removing or altering them would send a signal to the public, to the media, and to Harry and Meghan themselves, that independence has limits, and that the family's authority is is absolute. The emotional tension was compounded by the media landscape. Even without official announcements, speculation ran rampant. Headlines teased potential shifts, commentators analyzed appearances for signs of tension, and social media erupted with theories, memes, and public opinion. Harry and Meghan knew that once the issue of titles became public, the consequences would extend far beyond family dynamics. Reputation, public perception, and their ability to operate independently on charitable and personal initiatives would all be affected. At night, the couple would discuss strategy and contingency plans. They debated potential public responses, the risks of compliance versus resistance, and the long-term implications for their legacy. But even strategic planning could not fully address the emotional reality. The potential loss of a title is a deeply personal event, tied to self-worth, public image, and familial recognition. Titles, for Harry and Meghan, represented more than just status. They were markers of achievement, symbols of responsibility, and instruments of influence. To have them threatened was to confront vulnerability in its most public, most intimate form. The palace made it clear, through subtle cues, private meetings, and controlled communications, that the decision was deliberate, strategic, and unavoidable unless Harry and Meghan acquiesced to certain conditions. Every nuance of language, every carefully orchestrated gesture, reinforced the message: authority, influence, and recognition within the monarchy are conditional. Compliance ensures partial control, defiance risks total exclusion, and the emotional stakes were enormous. Beyond the strategic considerations, beyond the public image, beyond the optics, the couple faced a personal reckoning. How much of themselves could they preserve in the face of familial authority? Could they retain dignity, purpose, and influence while submitting to directives that undermined the autonomy they had fought to establish? These questions loomed over every discussion, every interaction, and every late-night planning session. By the time the week ended, it was clear that the conversation about titles would not be theoretical. Decisions were imminent. The couple felt the psychological pressure of knowing that their roles within the royal family, and by extension, their identity, autonomy, and public influence, were in the balance. Every advisor, every palace official, every subtle glance reinforced the reality. Titles are not guarantees. They are privileges, and privileges can be revoked. And as they prepared for the next steps, Harry and Meghan understood that the consequences of this confrontation would ripple outward. The loss or alteration of a title would not only affect their public roles, but would shape their ability to continue charitable work, influence public opinion, and maintain personal independence. The stakes were monumental, and the emotional toll was profound. The media had been watching Harry and Meghan for years, dissecting every word, scrutinizing every gesture, and spinning narratives that ranged from heroic to scandalous. But nothing could have prepared the couple for the intensity of scrutiny that followed the brewing storm over their charity and titles. By the time whispers of internal palace disputes began leaking, the media frenzy hit like a tidal wave, sweeping across tabloids, mainstream outlets, and social media platforms in a way that was both overwhelming and relentless. It started with subtle hints, anonymously sourced insider comments in trusted publications, carefully phrased to suggest tension without confirming specifics. Headlines were cautious at first: royal family in quiet turmoil. Tensions rise between Sussexes and royals. Social media, however, amplified every nuance, dissecting smiles and photos, interpreting pauses and speeches, and speculating wildly on the couple's state of mind. What might have been a private family matter quickly became a global spectacle. The frenzy was exhausting and relentless. Every public appearance, no matter how routine, was scrutinized frame by frame. Analysts debated body language, photo angles, and the subtle choices in clothing, suggesting hidden messages of defiance or submission. Commentators interpreted casual gestures as strategic signals. A hand on a shoulder meant reconciliation. A sidelong glance meant tension. Nothing was left unexamined. Nothing allowed to remain neutral. Harry and Meghan found themselves navigating a labyrinth of perception that was as exhausting as it was unforgiving. Behind the cameras and columns, the emotional toll was significant. Meghan, who had long endured intense media criticism, found herself reliving familiar patterns, but amplified. The intensity of speculation, coupled with internal pressure from the palace, created a perfect storm of anxiety and vigilance. Harry, protective and ever aware of the stakes, grappled with the dual reality of managing public perception while navigating deeply personal attacks on their integrity and independence. Every media cycle felt like a battle, every headline a challenge to their resilience. One of the most damaging aspects of the media frenzy was the rapid spread of misinformation. Rumors, unverified claims, and speculative reporting created an environment in which truth became difficult to discern. Stories suggested that Harry and Meghan were losing control of their charity, that their titles were in immediate jeopardy, and that internal family conflicts were spilling into public view. Each article and tweet escalated the perceived crisis, creating additional pressure on the couple to respond, strategically, publicly, and emotionally, before narratives solidified. The public reaction added another layer of intensity. Polls reflected a divided audience. Some sympathized deeply with Harry and Meghan, admiring their courage, independence, and charitable work. Others criticized them for perceived arrogance, insubordination, or disruption of tradition. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of opinion, with threads stretching for thousands of comments, hashtags trending across continents, and commentary from high-profile influencers amplifying every rumor. The couple was caught between the private realities of palace politics and the very public court of opinion, forced to balance diplomacy with personal integrity under extraordinary scrutiny. Even routine charitable events were no longer safe from speculation. Photographs from charity launches or public visits were analyzed for perceived emotional cues. Smiles were interpreted as defiance or reconciliation, handshakes were dissected for power dynamics, and casual interactions were framed as symbolic confrontations. The media frenzy created a surreal environment. Nothing was neutral, everything carried meaning, and every public appearance had to be executed with precision to avoid further misinterpretation. The frenzy also exposed the inherent contradictions of royal life. Harry and Meghan were celebrated as modernizers, as figures willing to challenge outdated norms, yet they were simultaneously expected to operate within centuries-old structures of hierarchy and protocol. The media played on these contradictions, framing every choice as either a triumph or a failure, and often exaggerating nuance into drama. This tension between expectation and action intensified the emotional strain on the couple, creating a constant need for vigilance, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience. Behind the scenes, advisors worked tirelessly to manage the narrative. Public relations teams coordinated statements, carefully crafted messaging, and attempted to anticipate media interpretations. Legal teams monitored for inaccuracies or defamatory claims, while private communications sought to maintain relationships with key journalists and outlets. But the sheer volume of speculation made it nearly impossible to control the narrative fully. Every response seemed to generate further questions. Every clarification sparked new debate, and every silence was interpreted as guilt, indecision, or acquiescence. Amid this chaos, the couple's private life was affected profoundly. Daily routines were interrupted by urgent communications, security protocols were heightened, and family interactions were strained by the stress of external scrutiny. Even personal moments, such as dinners, walks, or private conversations, were weighed against the potential for leaks, misinterpretation, or unwanted attention. The frenzy was not just a public spectacle, it was a constant, pervasive pressure that infiltrated every aspect of their lives. Interestingly, the frenzy also revealed unexpected dynamics within the media itself. Some journalists and commentators, previously critical, became sources of support or sympathetic analysis, highlighting the nuanced complexity of Harry and Meghan's situation. Others, however, seized upon the crisis to sensationalize conflict, emphasizing betrayal, drama, and scandal over factual reporting. The couple was forced to navigate a landscape in which allies and adversaries were sometimes indistinguishable, further complicating decisions about how to communicate publicly. In the midst of this media storm, one fact became abundantly clear: perception had become a form of power. The palace understood this implicitly. Every subtle leak, carefully phrased comment and behind-the-scenes revelation influenced not only public opinion, but internal leverage. The media frenzy, though seemingly chaotic and unpredictable, was in part a reflection of controlled narratives designed to shape the broader context in which Harry and Meghan operated. The emotional and strategic stakes converged when the first formal media mentions of the charity restructuring and title scrutiny appeared. Headlines suggested an internal rift within the royal family, sparking global curiosity and debate. Commentary ranged from sympathy to condemnation, creating an environment in which every subsequent action by Harry and Meghan would be intensely scrutinized. The couple faced a dual challenge: navigating internal palace expectations while managing a public narrative that was often incomplete, distorted, or outright misleading. And yet, despite the pressure, Harry and Meghan remained deliberate and focused. They coordinated responses, reinforced their messaging, and maintained public appearances with measured grace. But the intensity of the media frenzy ensured that no action, however careful, could fully mitigate scrutiny. Every gesture became symbolic, every word subject to analysis, and every public moment a potential flashpoint. By the end of this stage, it was clear that the media frenzy was not merely background noise. It was a defining factor in the unfolding crisis. It amplified tension, shaped perception, and created additional pressure on Harry and Meghan to respond strategically, emotionally, and publicly. The couple was now navigating a perfect storm. Internal palace dynamics threatening their charity and titles, combined with global media scrutiny that magnified every decision, misstep, or emotional reaction. And yet, even amidst this chaos, the personal toll was undeniable. Private moments of reflection, quiet dinners, and family time were overshadowed by the constant awareness of external judgment. Trust, already strained, became harder to navigate, and every interaction carried the weight of potential public interpretation. The media frenzy had transformed a private family issue into a global spectacle, one that tested the resilience, strategy, and emotional fortitude of Harry and Meghan in ways no one outside the palace could fully appreciate. Family conflicts are never simple, but within the royal family, the stakes are exponentially higher. Every disagreement, every subtle tension, is amplified by tradition, protocol, and the unrelenting public gaze. For Harry and Meghan, the storm over their charity and the threat to their titles had already set the stage for a dramatic confrontation. But what truly changed the landscape was the revelation of sibling rivalry, raw and undeniable, between Harry and William. It had always existed in subtle forms. Harry, the younger brother, had long navigated a life under the shadow of William's position as heir apparent. From childhood, comparisons were inevitable: achievements, temperament in public appearances, and even perception of leadership. Meghan, entering the family as an outsider, quickly sensed the dynamic. She had experienced high-stakes social scrutiny before, but never one so intimately tied to history, hierarchy, and the intricate dance of royal protocol. Now, however, the rivalry was no longer subtle. It had escalated, fueled by strategic moves, perceived slights, and the growing pressure of public expectation. William, conscious of his responsibilities to maintain the monarchy's image, approached interactions with Harry with both caution and calculation. Every word, every gesture, every suggestion was weighed not only against protocol, but also against perceived loyalty and alignment. To William, Harry's growing independence, amplified by Meghan's influence, was both a challenge and a threat. For Harry, the tension was personal and deeply felt. He had grown into a role that, while unofficially defined, carried immense responsibility, supporting charitable initiatives, representing the monarchy abroad, and navigating public expectations. Yet he now faced an unmistakable message: independence would come at a cost. Every initiative he undertook, every decision he made alongside Meghan, was scrutinized not just by the public, but by his own brother. And in that scrutiny lay a subtle, yet powerful, assertion of control, the reminder that in family, as in monarchy, power is hierarchical and autonomy is limited. The charity restructuring and the threat to titles acted as catalysts. Suddenly, Minor tensions that might have been dismissed as sibling rivalry were elevated to matters of authority, legacy, and control. Conversations in private meetings, once seemingly benign, were now laden with subtext. Words were chosen carefully, delivered with precision, and interpreted through a lens of familial history and unspoken competition. Even casual remarks became charged with meaning, signaling loyalty, dissent, or ambition. Meghan, keenly aware of the dynamics, sought to mediate without undermining Harry. She recognized the complexity. Confronting William directly could escalate conflict, yet allowing subtle power plays to continue unchallenged risked long-term consequences. Her challenge was unprecedented, balancing the emotional needs of her husband, the political realities of the palace, and the personal intricacies of sibling dynamics that were centuries in the making. The tension was exacerbated by advisors who acted as both intermediaries and agents of influence. Some were loyal to William, others to Harry. Their advice, often well-intentioned, sometimes magnified divisions. Subtle suggestions about phrasing, timing, and strategy carried additional weight because they were interpreted as signals of support or alignment with one side or the other. The result was a complex web of communication in which trust became a scarce commodity. The rivalry was also visible in subtle nonverbal cues. Body language became a form of dialogue, a pause, a sidelong glance, a measured nod. Advisors and staff, trained to observe and report, began to catalog these interactions, noting patterns, deviations, and inconsistencies. Harry and William were no strangers to public scrutiny, but the intensity of private observation added a new layer of psychological pressure. Every expression, every gesture, could be interpreted as compliance, defiance, or hidden intention. A pivotal moment occurred during one private meeting regarding the charity's future. William, calm but assertive, emphasized the importance of legacy and alignment, framing his position as protection of institutional stability. Harry, already emotionally strained by media scrutiny and the looming threat to titles, responded with a mix of frustration and diplomacy, defending his vision for the charity while navigating the delicate familial power dynamic. Meghan observed, intervening only when necessary, balancing support for Harry with careful navigation of palace etiquette. The discussion illuminated the depth of the sibling rivalry. William's approach, though measured, carried a clear message. Autonomy would be tolerated only if it aligned with established hierarchy. Harry's response, composed but firm, reflected both determination and a deep awareness of the stakes. Independence, once challenged, required strategic defense. And Meghan's presence added an additional layer of complexity, as her influence both empowered Harry and introduced an external perspective into historically internal dynamics. Outside observers, if they could see these interactions, might describe them as tense but polite, respectful yet competitive. But for those inside the room, every word, every pause, every gesture was charged with significance. The rivalry was no longer a background narrative. It was a defining factor shaping decisions, relationships, and the unfolding crisis. The stakes were clear: control over charity, protection of titles, and the broader question of autonomy versus hierarchy. The sibling rivalry also had emotional dimensions that extended beyond strategy. Harry, recalling childhood experiences of comparison and expectation, felt a mix of resentment, loyalty, and responsibility. William, conscious of his role as future king and protector of the monarchy's image, navigated a balance between familial care and institutional obligation. The result was a complex interplay of affection, tension, and unspoken competition, one that shaped every decision, every discussion, and every public appearance. And then came the leaks. Observers outside the palace, privy to the subtleties of interactions, began sharing hints of tension. The media seized upon these cues, framing the narrative as a rift between brothers, amplified by Meghan's presence. Social media exploded with speculation. Was Harry rebelling against William? Was Meghan influencing decisions? Were titles and charities being weaponized as tools of control? The public perception magnified the rivalry, transforming private dynamics into global spectacle. Amid this, Harry and Meghan recognized the stakes were no longer purely operational or procedural. they were profoundly emotional. The sibling rivalry, once subtle, had become a central theme in the unfolding crisis. It shaped the charity restructuring, the threat to titles, and the couple's strategic and emotional responses. Every decision carried dual consequences: institutional and personal, public and private. And yet, despite the tension, the couple remained resolute. They understood that yielding entirely would not only compromise autonomy, but also empower a dynamic they felt was unfair and constraining. They also knew that resisting outright could escalate conflict, damage public perception, and further inflame media speculation. The delicate balance between strategy and emotion, autonomy and allegiance, had never been more precarious. As the week drew to a close, the realization became inescapable. The sibling rivalry was not a minor subplot. It was a central force driving every interaction, decision, and consequence. And in the palace, where hierarchy, tradition, and image intertwine, the rivalry would influence not only Harry and Meghan's immediate situation, but also their long-term position, public perception, and personal well-being. When decisions are made behind closed doors, their consequences rarely remain private. For Harry and Meghan, the aftershocks of the meetings, media frenzy, and sibling rivalry didn't stay confined to strategy sessions or palace corridors. They erupted into an emotional reality that neither could ignore. The couple had always understood that public life carries pressure, but nothing had prepared them for the layered, persistent emotional fallout from the simultaneous threats to their charity, their titles, and their independence. The first impact was immediate and visceral. Meghan, usually composed in the face of scrutiny, found herself struggling with intense feelings of betrayal and frustration. She had poured years of energy into charitable initiatives, and now, it seemed, the very foundations of her work could be rewritten by family members who claimed to act in the name of legacy. The realization that influence she thought she wielded could be stripped so subtly